The most important reason for the economic crisis in Venezuela was the U.S. economic war and the sanctions, period. I mean, the Venezuelan government did commit some errors, which we can talk about, but the most important reason, that if you cannot understand anything without understanding the fact that Venezuela for 100 years has been a petrostate that has relied on exporting its oil. The U.S. put very heavy sanctions on Venezuela, leading to an economic embargo that prevented Venezuela from producing and exporting its oil, which the government relied on, and it faced a severe economic crisis. It's not because of socialism and all of that. In fact, in Venezuela, the vast majority of the economy has always remained private. But they did have a very progressive government that launched the Bolivarian Revolution that nationalized the oil industry in particular, which was very important. So Venezuela faces the economic problems that many resource-rich countries have faced that economists often refer to as Dutch disease or the resource curse, right? There's this idea that having a lot of natural resources is something very good because your country can become wealthy. Well, yes and no. It can also be a curse because what happens is that a country that has a lot of natural resources often simply exports those natural resources and lives off the rent of the exports, but does not actually develop other industries. This is a problem that we've seen in many countries, Saudi Arabia as being the clear example, right? Where, in Saudi Arabia, the vast majority of the population does not even have citizenship. The majority of the population consists of migrant workers, largely from South Asia, Southeast Asia, who are treated horribly, basically like slaves. This is the same model in the UAE, in Qatar, in Bahrain. So you have a small elite, like 5 to 10% of the population actually has citizenship, and they benefit from the natural resources, but the country basically relies on exploiting this foreign labor that's paid very low. Now, if you look in Venezuela, so Venezuela has been a petrostate for 100 years before Hugo Chavez, the revolutionary, was born. And then what happened is, for most of its history, that oil did not benefit the majority of the population. That oil benefited a small handful of elites, like in Saudi Arabia. And you can read, it's just disgusting. I've spent a lot of time in Venezuela, and you can read the books written by some of the former elites, like Vanessa Neumann, who was a daughter of one of the wealthiest Venezuelan oligarchs. And she was involved in this coup attempt with Juan Guaido, where the U.S. tried to appoint this fake president, Juan Guaido, who never participated in a presidential election. The Trump administration appointed him as the fake president of Venezuela and tried to pressure other countries to recognize him. Well, one of his so-called ambassadors to the UK was Vanessa Neumann, from one of the wealthiest families in the country. And she wrote a book in which she literally makes fun of people in the US for being poor compared to her lifestyle growing up before the Bolivarian Revolution. And she said that we were so rich that we would fly to Miami in the morning and go shopping and spend thousands of dollars and then fly back to Venezuela at night. She boasted about this in her book. So that's how Venezuela was until the Bolivarian Revolution. And then Hugo Chavez, who was also, speaking of left-wing military officers, he was a military officer from a very poor background, and he was influenced by the history of the left-wing movements in Latin America and also by liberation theology. And he originally tried a military coup against a brutal right-wing leader, Carlos Andrés Pérez, who carried out a massacre. There were protests against his neoliberal policies that were backed by the IMF, the Washington Consensus policies. And Carlos Andrés Pérez, this US-backed right-wing Venezuelan leader, he ordered a massacre of Venezuelan protesters. Thousands of civilians were killed and injured in what was known as the Caracazo. And some military officers, they were radicalized by this experience and they became revolutionaries. And Hugo Chavez tried to overthrow him and have a left-wing military takeover, and he failed, and then Chavez was imprisoned. And then he became such a popular figure in popular Venezuelan consciousness in the 90s that he was pardoned, and then he ran for president in 1998, and he won the election fair and square in 1999. And then Hugo Chavez launched the Bolivarian Revolution, named after Simón Bolívar, the leftist, the anti-colonial leader who fought against Spanish colonialism. And in the 18th and early 19th century. And Bolivar helped create the modern countries of Venezuela, Colombia, Bolivia. That's why Bolivia is named after him, right? Ecuador. So anyway, so Chavez went back to this history of Bolivar. He created the Bolivarian Revolution, and he nationalized the oil industry that historically had been used to benefit the elites. Instead, he used that oil revenue to fund social programs. The Venezuelan government has built more than 5 million housing units for poor and working people that they provide at very low cost. I've seen some of the housing. I mean, it's, they're apartments. They're not like super luxury housing, but they're better than many of the apartments I lived in New York, right? I mean, they're solid quality apartments that they provide to poor people. They funded healthcare and education. So really, they used that oil wealth to benefit the population. However, the U.S., they always faced, Chavez and his successor Maduro, they always faced a fundamental problem. The economy has always been heavily reliant on oil, and it did not have many other industries. They tried to diversify, but it's very difficult to convince people, for instance, to go out and live in the countryside to grow food, because Venezuela historically imported the majority of its food. So as recently as 2019, when the U.S. launched this coup with Juan Guaido and all of that, Venezuela was still importing about half of its food from other countries. So then the U.S. put all these sanctions on Venezuela. It could no longer export its oil, and it could no longer import not only things like food, but also it couldn't import the machine parts and the capital goods it needed to fix the equipment and that it needed to export the oil, right? I mean, obviously, oil doesn't just magically come out of the ground. You have to drill it. And when you're drilling it, you have to use this technology that needs to be kept up, right? If it breaks, you have to repair it. Well, if you can't import that technology because it was all made by U.S. companies, because even though Chavez nationalized the oil industry, it was using technology that over many decades had been built by U.S. companies, right? They didn't have a significant technology sector. So with the sanctions, it became very difficult to keep up all of the oil production. It started declining. Then we talked about earlier the U.S. shale boom, which also collapsed oil prices. There was also the end of the commodity supercycle that hit many countries in Latin America. There was this congruence of many different factors. And then the sanctions just made it, they collapsed Venezuela's oil sector. And if you go to the U.S. Energy Information Administration website, the EIA, they boasted about this in the Trump administration. They posted a graph, and they say something like, this was in 2019, and it says, oil production in Venezuela has fallen to its lowest levels in modern history. And they're basically boasting that was because of the sanctions. And you can see I have a graph that I often show in my reports. It shows that every time the U.S. imposed sanctions, oil production declined. So people say, it's socialism, blah, blah, blah. People who say that know nothing about Venezuela. And again, this is not a problem of socialism. This is a problem that many oil exporting countries have faced. And can you imagine what would happen to Saudi Arabia's economy if the U.S. put sanctions on Saudi Arabia and said that it cannot export oil? It would probably face an even worse economic crisis.
Yeah. And at this point, I don't think it's possible because Saudi Arabia is sort of drifting away from that anyway. And like you said before, China's a great customer for them. But wasn't there some...
One other quick note. Quick note on this. Venezuela was kind of like the canary in the coal mine. So, this de-dollarization initiative, it's not new. In fact, this goes back decades, but famously in Iraq, Saddam Hussein actually was selling his oil in euro. And this was in the 2000s, the euro was still new and people thought that the euro could challenge the dollar. And obviously that didn't happen. But de-dollarization has been a project for many years. Muammar Gaddafi in Libya also wanted to create a gold-backed Pan-African currency and sell his oil in gold and euros and other currencies. Well, but anyway, the point is Venezuela, for a decade now, for over a decade, has been trying to sell its oil in other currencies and actually has. Venezuela has sold its oil in rubles and in Chinese yuan. And also it's bartered its oil for other countries. And so recently we saw a massive increase in interest in de-dollarization. And that's because in 2022, over the war in Ukraine, the West, not only did they put sanctions on Russia, but they froze $300 billion of the Russian central bank's foreign exchange reserves that were largely held in Western banks. Now, this was a huge wake-up call because people around the world, central banks around the world were saying, if the West can freeze, that is essentially steal, Russia's central bank foreign exchange reserves, they could easily do it to us. Anything we hold in dollars, you don't physically hold the dollars. The dollars are not like, the vast majority of dollars in the world are not paper. The vast majority are simply dollars that are digital. They're decimals on a computer screen, right? And so what happened is the West froze Russia's central bank reserves. Well, that was not the first time. First, the US froze Iran's central bank reserves. But people were like, well, Iran, that's a special case. They're not going to do the same thing to us. Then the US froze Afghanistan's central bank reserves. Then the US froze Venezuela's central bank reserves. And more countries are saying, wow, well, actually, originally it was just Iran. Then it was Afghanistan. Now it's Venezuela. And still today, there are billions of dollars of Venezuela's foreign exchange reserves that it cannot get access to, including over $1 billion, nearly $2 billion worth of gold that the British central bank, the Bank of England, has refused to give back. And then finally, Russia. And that was like the straw that broke the camel's back. And now, even longtime allies, I mentioned Saudi Arabia, even Saudi Arabia is now de-dollarizing because they're afraid that the US did it to Iran, to Afghanistan, to Venezuela, to Russia. We could easily be next. If the US decides we no longer like the government, we're going to freeze your foreign exchange reserves. And now one of the most insane things that the West is doing is they're openly, publicly talking about using the foreign exchange reserves they stole from Russia in order to pay for reconstruction in Ukraine and to buy military equipment for Ukraine. You can see this in the New York Times. So countries like Egypt and the UAE and Saudi Arabia, historic US allies, are being like, wow, we should try to de-dollarize because the US could easily do that to us as well. And that's what they're doing.
So many countries out there represent sort of working. They're like a working class person. They go out there, they make stuff, and they sell it on the. United States is like a mugger. He comes up and says, "Give me what you got. Let me hold you upside down by your ankles and give me what." We ran out of time today. I had so many questions. We didn't even get to the dangerously insane Milei down in Argentina, what he's sort of representing. Come back and do this again, would you?
Absolutely, I'd love to. I'll conclude with one final note because you mentioned like the analogy of the U.S. as the mugger. I like that. I owe all the credit to the economist Michael Hudson. I mean, he's absolutely brilliant, and he wrote a book in the 70s that was called Super Imperialism, and he's since updated it. He recently released the 3rd edition, and in this book, he showed how the U.S. empire is fundamentally different from the empires before it. I mean, we really are living in a historical era because the previous empires before it, going back to the political economist Giovanni Arrighi, and also Emanuel Wallerstein, they identified 4 kind of main eras of what they were in the history of modern history of capitalism, and what they referred to as cycles of accumulation. And they had the peak of the Dutch Empire, well, the Italian city-states first, and then the Dutch Empire, and then the British Empire, and then the US Empire. But the difference is that, so in each of those eras, in those cycles of world accumulation, the dominant currency was the currency of the empire. The Dutch currency, the British pound, and the US dollar. However, even at the peak of the British Empire, in which the British controlled nearly 1/4 of world landmass, still, the pound was not used outside of the British sphere of influence. A little bit, but not that much. The US empire is fundamentally different in the sense that not only is it not as territorialized as Britain, it doesn't physically control the land of many of these countries, but in terms of the international financial infrastructure, the US has colonized basically all of the world. And until recently, basically everywhere, every country used the dollar for international trade and for their foreign exchange reserves. I mean, no other country was ever able to control as much of the world economic territory, financial territory. And Michael Hudson showed back in the 70s when Richard Nixon took the dollar off of gold in 1971, because before that, after the end of World War II and the Bretton Woods system, the dollar was the international reserve currency, but it was pegged to gold. And then the other major currencies were pegged to the dollar, like in Europe. But fundamentally, it meant that all of the dollars that existed technically had to be backed by gold in this Federal Reserve at a set price of 1 ounce of gold was 35 US dollars. However, the US began printing more and more dollars and running low on its gold reserves to pay for the war on Korea and the war on Vietnam and its growing international empire, right? And Michael Hudson showed how this led to countries exchanging their dollars for gold because they realized the dollar was actually very overvalued. And this led to a crisis. And then Richard Nixon responded by taking the dollar off of gold in 1971. And ever since then, the US has had this massive empire where its currency is used, but it doesn't need to be backed by anything, which means the US can print dollars in order to pay for imports, in order to pay for its military industrial complex. But that inflation is felt around the world because everyone uses the dollar, right? Yeah. And this is why people used to say, like the French used to complain, including, Charles de Gaulle, the French leader after World War II. He famously complained that the US had an exorbitant privilege. And they used to say that for every $100 bill the US printed, it cost them 17 cents to print the $100 bill, but it was worth $100. Whereas today, it costs the US nothing because most of those $100 bills are, they're decimals on a computer screen. So this is why de-dollarization is so important, because fundamentally the US empire is not like any empire before it, and it uses that financial control as a political weapon. But what we've seen really just in the past decade and really in the past few years is a massive historical shift away from that. And that's why I think it's so important to understand these geopolitical issues.
Yeah. They took themselves off the gold standard and put themselves on the bomb standard. Said, if you don't like how much money we're printing, we'll just kill you. How about that? I want to thank Ben Norton for coming on the show. Geopolitical Economy Report. You can check him out on his website, and there'll be links in the description, I'm sure. And as well on YouTube, you can check him out. One of the most influential and my favorite analyst on all these things, Ben Norton. Thanks for coming on. Let's chat right after this.
Of course. Thanks for having me. And I'd be happy to come back in the future.
All right. Bye, everybody.